The air in the sterile high-end mountain lodge was thin, cold and heavy, with the scent of polished leather and unearned superiority. Outside, the first biting snow of the season began to dust the jagged peaks. Inside, the light was too bright, focusing like a spotlight on the small, shivering creature that lay huddled near the grand stone fireplace, and the tall, immaculately dressed man towering over it. "Look at this mess," the man, Arthur, spat, his voice sharp and utterly devoid of warmth, echoing slightly off the vast, exposed beams of the A-frame ceiling. Arthur wore an expensive cashmere sweater that looked utterly out of place next to the desperation he was creating. "Honestly, Mark, I told you this animal was a mistake, a stray, a problem." Mark, the subject of Arthur's contempt, was kneeling on the imported Persian rug. His hands, calloused and rough from real work, were gently stroking the matted, weak fur of the dog. The dog, a handsome but now pitiful blend of shepherd and something wild, barely lifted its head. Its name was Ghost, a name Mark had given him a year ago when he first found him, but now felt cruelly ironic. Ghost was fading, too heavy a burden for the already struggling Mark. He needs a vet, sir," Mark said softly, not looking up, his focus absolute on the dog. His own clothes were practical, meant for the harsh mountain environment, a sharp contrast to the lodge's extravagant comfort. "He has a bad cough. It's the cold getting into his lungs." Arthur let out a harsh, dry sound that was not quite a laugh but carried all the derision of one. He took a single, deliberate step back, as if the mere proximity to the sick animal might contaminate his Italian shoes. "A vet? Do you know what a vet costs up here, Mark? More than you make in a month. More than this thing is worth. This isn't a resort for sick animals, Mark. This is my property, and I want the problem removed." The words were short, brutal, designed not just to dismiss the dog, but to wound Mark. They were meant to paint Mark as weak, sentimental, and ultimately useless. I didn't argue. I couldn't. How do you argue with a mountain of cold entitlement? Arthur didn't see a life in need. He saw a misplaced cushion, a spot of dirt on his immaculate vision of wealth. I knew in that exact moment that his lack of empathy was the only thing uglier than the state of Ghost. Mark slowly and carefully lifted Ghost into his arms. The dog felt too light, a fragile collection of bones and failing spirit. The lodge staff, cleaners, a chef, a maintenance worker, were all pretending not to watch, their eyes fixed on the marble floors, their silence deafening. Their enforced invisibility was a secondary layer of cruelty, making the humiliation perfectly public, perfectly isolated. "Just put it outside, Mark, where you found it. It's nature's way," Arthur instructed, waving a dismissive hand toward the massive carved oak door that led to the deepening twilight and the snow. "And then you can go too. I don't employ people who prioritize stray dogs over their assigned duties. You're fired. Effective immediately." Mark finally looked up. His eyes, usually warm and steady, were now filled with a deep, still hurt, not anger. He saw not just a man who was heartless, but a man who was actively choosing cruelty. He saw the cold, self-satisfied smirk on Arthur's face, a man who thought his wealth gave him the right to play God with small lives. "It's not nature's way, sir," Mark said, his voice low, steady, a sudden island of conviction in the storm of Arthur's arrogance. "It's your way. And I hope you never need the kindness you refuse to show." Arthur chuckled, a sound like glass breaking. "I need kindness? Mark, I own this entire valley. The only thing I need is silence and obedience. Now go." Mark turned away, cradling the dog tighter. The weight of the world felt transferred to his chest. He didn't plead, didn't beg, didn't look back at the people who stood frozen in their complicity. He just walked toward the immense front doors. The moment he stepped outside, the wind slammed the door shut behind him. the thick oak sealing the warmth inside and expelling him and Ghost into the rapidly dropping temperature. The snow was falling harder now, big, wet flakes that quickly began to coat the ground. Mark stumbled, the reality of the situation hitting him with the force of the mountain air, fired, alone, and holding a dying dog. He had no money, no connections up here, and the nearest town was a grueling 15-mile hike away. He looked down at Ghost, whose breath was shallow and strained. I carried him until my arms felt like they would break, until the cold seeped into my bones. Every step I took away from the lodge felt like a step deeper into failure. I knew I couldn't save him. The cold was a predator I couldn't outrun. But as I held him, looking at the distant glittering lights of Arthur's lodge, a beacon of excess and indifference, a small, silent promise formed in my heart. I wouldn't just survive this. I would make sure that coldness, that arrogance, that belief that one person's life or one animal's life was disposable would eventually face its own reckoning. The universe keeps score, even if Arthur thought his bank account shielded him from the consequences of his actions. I promised Ghost, I promised myself, that this unjust beginning was not the end. It was simply the opening scene to a story they never saw coming. The last image before the scene shifts is Mark turning back, his silhouette tiny against the vast, unforgiving mountain landscape, staring at the lights of the lodge. The air hums with the silent declaration of a destiny that has just been forged in the crucible of absolute cruelty. The world had pushed him to his lowest point, but in doing so, it had simply revealed the unbreakable steel of his character. He was walking away with nothing, yet carrying the seed of a profound and inevitable justice. Before we continue, comment your city and country here. I want to know how far this story will reach. Mark staggered through the heavy, wet snow, his breath coming out in ragged white clouds. He couldn't feel his hands anymore, but the dull ache in his chest, the pain of betrayal and helplessness, was far sharper than the cold. He had walked about a mile from the lodge, deep enough into the woods that the lodge lights were just a faint, cold yellow glow, visible only between the thick, snow-laden pines. He had to stop. Ghost's breathing had grown even shallower, reduced to tiny, painful whistles. He sank down onto a cluster of mossy, snow-covered rocks, pulling his heavy jacket around the dog in a futile attempt to share warmth. Ghost looked up at him with eyes that seemed to hold all the sorrow and acceptance of the wild world. I looked at him, and I knew. The cold had won this round. I didn't have the medicine, I didn't have the fire, I didn't have the strength to carry us both much further. Letting him go felt like tearing a piece of my own soul out, but the alternative, watching him suffer for another hour, was worse. Mark laid Ghost down carefully in a small, sheltered recess beneath a fallen log, wrapping him tightly with the worn wool scarf that had been his only comfort. He stroked the dog's head one last time, whispering promises of peace and memory. He didn't leave immediately. He sat there in the deepening gloom, the snow coating his shoulders, waiting until the faint, struggling breaths became still. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. The injustice of it all. That a life of such fierce loyalty could end so coldly, dismissed by the cruel indifference of a man who owned everything, was a physical weight that pressed down on him. Mark eventually stood, his body stiff and aching, his spirit hollowed out. He looked back towards the lodge, a fortress of opulence perched high on the mountain, Arthur's lodge. It was a monument to the very world Mark had just been violently ejected from, the world of inequality. The lodge, known as the Apex, was a place of absurd, cinematic luxury. It wasn't just a house, it was a statement, the kind of place where the marble floors echoed like judgment. They were imported, veined with silver, and felt perpetually cold, even when the underfloor heating was blasting. Every piece of wood was old-growth cedar, every window a panoramic wall of glass designed to show the powerful owners their dominion over the world below. Mark remembered his brief 3-month employment there. He wasn't a waiter or a concierge. He was a silent, efficient utility man, the kind of worker who fixed the generator when the power failed, maintained the sophisticated water filtration system, and ensured the massive fireplaces never went out. He was essential, yet invisible. He spent his days moving through the shadows, always wearing the neutral-colored uniform, a ghost in the machine of opulence. He learned every circuit, every pipe, every silent flaw in Arthur's perfect, expensive domain. He saw the arrogance up close, the casual dismissal of anyone who was paid by the hour. One afternoon, Arthur's son, a pampered, entitled teenager named Julian, had spilled a glass of rare, expensive wine onto the white rug in the main living area. He had simply shouted for Mark, who was down in the basement checking the furnace. When Mark finally arrived, Julian hadn't even looked up from his tablet. "Clean that up," Julian had commanded, pointing with a long, lazy finger. "And don't look at me. It's disgusting. Just fix it." Mark had simply taken the supplies and worked the stain, meticulously and calmly. He wasn't insulted. He was observing. He saw not a teenager, but the mirror image of Arthur's soul, a hollowness created by never having to face a single consequence. The marble floors echoed like judgment. Yes, but I kept walking, not proud, just honest. I knew my work was real. Their money was a concept. My ability to fix the things their money broke was a reality. They lived in a fortress of glass, but their world was fragile because it depended on the skills of people they refused to see. He remembered the constant flow of Arthur's guests, loud, dismissive men and women who treated the staff like furniture. They talked about market disruption and asset acquisition, while casually wasting food and tossing half-smoked cigars onto the carefully manicured terrace. Mark listened to all of it, processing the casual cruelty like a scientist studying a new, repellent species. He saw Arthur at his worst, not when he was screaming, but when he was being subtly, poisonously cruel. Once, Arthur had asked the chef to prepare a complex, difficult dish, then sent it back untouched, simply stating, "It lacks ambition. Try again." The chef, an older man with tired eyes, had to throw away hours of work. Arthur didn't care about the food. He cared about demonstrating his absolute power to waste time and resources. Mark, the utility man, was trying only to do the right thing, to maintain the integrity of the mountain home, but he was treated as invisible. I wasn't born rich, not even close. I grew up with the understanding that if something was broken, you fixed it, and if someone was hurting, you helped them. I carried something no money could buy: conscience. And in that lodge, conscience was the rarest, most undervalued commodity of all. Now, standing out in the cold, Mark knew he had to keep moving. He thought of Ghost, buried under the snow-covered log, a silent victim of Arthur's final callous act. The cold was a physical reminder of the world's indifference, but it also started to sharpen Mark's resolve, honing the quiet dignity he possessed into a weapon. The snow-laden woods were dangerous, but they felt more honest than the false warmth of the lodge. The mountain had taken his dog, but it wouldn't take his spirit. He looked one last time at the distant, glittering house of cold comfort and turned his back on it, walking towards the unknown valley below. He was walking toward a future that, by necessity, would be built on the strength of his own character, the very thing Arthur believed was worthless. This was his true severance package, not a check, but a purpose forged in pain. The descent from the apex was treacherous. The new snow concealed sheets of ice, and Mark's worn work boots struggled to find purchase. He walked for nearly 6 hours before reaching the low-lying valley road, emerging into the faint, grey light of the dawn. He was exhausted, hungry, and emotionally drained, but the weight of the injustice had been replaced by a quiet, determined focus. The necessity of survival had taken over. He eventually hitchhiked into a small, nondescript town named Havenwood, a place built around logging and the occasional tourist overflow from the wealthier mountain resorts. He found the cheapest motel room available, a small, clean space with a heater that rattled but worked, and collapsed. The next morning, Mark started his new life. He had very little: the clothes on his back, a few $100s in cash, and a worn leather wallet containing his identification and a single, smooth, cool piece of obsidian, a stone he had carried since childhood, a reminder of silence and strength. He didn't seek out high-paying jobs, he sought out work that was needed. He began frequenting the local hardware stores and auto repair shops, offering his services as a handyman. His hands knew things. They knew how to diagnose the sick hum of a generator, how to troubleshoot faulty wiring, and how to coax life back into old engines. He possessed the rare, practical wisdom that had been completely invisible to the people at the apex. His first real opportunity came not from a business, but from an old woman named Clara, who ran the small, dilapidated town library. Her furnace had died in the middle of a cold snap, and the local repair company had quoted her a prohibitive price, suggesting she simply replace the entire unit. Mark walked into the library, smelling of pine and cold air. Clara, bundled in 3 cardigans, looked up at him with weary skepticism. He wasn't a professional contractor, he was just a man asking if he could look at her problem. "They said it's too old, dear," Clara told him, gesturing toward the ancient, shuddering beast of a furnace in the dusty basement. "They said the whole thing is shot." Mark didn't grab his tools immediately. He sat next to the furnace, listening. He closed his eyes, his head tilted, his concentration absolute. He was listening to the machine's sorrowful death rattle, trying to discern the rhythm of its malfunction. The local experts had looked at the surface, the burnt fuses, the corroded connections, and prescribed an expensive replacement. Mark, however, looked deeper. While others mocked, I learned to listen. Silence is an expert's greatest tool. Arthur and his guests, they talked over the truth. They ignored the quiet desperation of the things they owned. But the machine, the dog, the tired worker, they never lie. He discovered a small, almost invisible crack in a seldom-used ventilation pipe that was allowing cold air to circulate back through the system, confusing the thermostat and forcing the pilot light to continuously cut out. It wasn't a broken system. It was a system that had been subtly choked, a 2-cent problem diagnosed as a $10,000 failure. Mark didn't make a fuss. He didn't boast about correcting the professionals. He simply replaced the pipe section with a piece he found in a junk pile behind the shop, cleaned the sensors, and restarted the furnace. Within an hour, the basement air was humming with gentle, consistent warmth. Clara came downstairs, her face etched with disbelief, then relief. She tried to pay him the modest sum she could afford. Mark refused half of it. "You keep the rest for books, Clara," he said, tucking the small amount he accepted into his wallet. "The kids need them warm in here." He walked away quickly before she could thank him profusely. He didn't need applause, he needed purpose. The silence was his only applause. From that day forward, the quiet respect started to bloom. People in Havenwood didn't know his past. They didn't know he had been a fired utility man from a billionaire's estate. They just knew Mark was the man who could fix anything without fanfare or overcharging. He fixed Mrs. Henderson's sputtering stove, tuned Mr. Miller's ancient snowplow, and rewired the entire electrical system of the local community center when it kept tripping. His reputation spread like a warm current through the cold town. He didn't have a grand title or a business card. He was just Mark, I realized then that humility is strength disguised. Arthur's arrogance was a fragile armor, easily pierced by simple truth. My silence, my willingness to work in the shadows, that was my real power. I wasn't building a company. I was building something far more valuable, trust. He was transforming his pain into a quiet, functional excellence. He was proving that his worth was innate, not assigned by a paycheck or an employer. He was doing exactly the kind of work that made the world functional, the kind of work Arthur had treated as invisible and disposable. And with every successful repair, with every warm room he restored, Mark rebuilt a piece of himself that Arthur had tried to shatter on that snowy night. He was learning how to be whole again, piece by piece, repair by repair. The silence in which he worked was, in fact, the deep sound of his own quiet triumph. Mark had established a steady, if modest, life in Havenwood. He rented a small, rustic cabin on the outskirts of town, heated by a refurbished wood stove, and his days were filled with honest labor. He was Mark, the fixer, the quiet man with the perceptive hands. But beneath the surface of the humble handyman lay a history that the residents of Havenwood, and certainly Arthur, could never have guessed. One cold evening, sitting by the wood stove, Mark opened his worn leather wallet. He pulled out the dark piece of obsidian, turning the cool, sharp-edged stone over in his fingers, feeling its inherent silence. Then, from a hidden, stitched compartment, he pulled out something else, a photograph and an old key. The photograph was slightly faded, showing a younger, impeccably dressed Mark, standing next to a smiling, silver-haired man in front of a sprawling, state-of-the-art facility, not a lodge, but a high-tech research and development campus. The key was heavy, antique, and engraved with a single, complex, stylized letter, T. I touched the old key on my chain, the only thing left from the life they took away. They saw my work boots and my stained jacket. They saw the desperation of a fired employee. They never saw the truth, that I wasn't just a utility man for Arthur. I was the architect of the infrastructure he relied on. Mark's full name was Marcus Thorne. The smiling man in the photo was his mentor, Elias Vance, the founder of Vance Integrated Systems, a multinational firm specializing in bespoke, ultra-secure off-grid infrastructure for high-net-worth individuals and corporate entities. Mark hadn't just fixed Arthur's systems, he had designed the sophisticated, proprietary security, heating and power grid that made the Apex Lodge functional and almost impervious to the mountain environment. 5 years prior, Mark had been Elias's protégé, primed to take over the company. He had the genius for engineering, the vision, and, crucially, the conscience that Elias valued above all else. But a catastrophic internal betrayal, a scheme involving corporate espionage and a massive data theft, had not only bankrupted Vance Systems, but had also tragically led to Elias's sudden death. The key Mark held was to a private vault, the only known physical backup of all of Vance Systems' proprietary designs and research. The location of the vault was a secret only 2 people ever knew, Elias and Mark. It was the legacy, the hidden blueprint of a multi-million-dollar corporation that was now lying dormant, waiting for the right moment. The people responsible for the betrayal, a consortium of greedy former executives who leveraged the data theft, had searched for the key and the vault for years, but failed. They thought Marcus Thorne was either dead or simply disappeared, another casualty of the crash. Mark had chosen to disappear not out of fear, but out of necessity. He needed time for the dust to settle, time to grieve, and time to understand the true scope of the damage. Working as a handyman in Havenwood was his chosen exile. It was his way of staying hidden in plain sight, honing his essential skills, and recovering the moral center that the corporate world had tried to steal from him. He was performing manual, honest labor while holding the blueprint for an industrial empire in his pocket. The arrogance of men like Arthur and the executives who destroyed Vance systems was that they only understood value when it came attached to a quarterly report or a visible title. They saw me as Mark, the hired help. They didn't realize that the man who fixes their broken toilet might also be the man who designed the entire water purification system for their multi-million-dollar estate. This hidden past was the true source of his quiet strength. It wasn't just that he could fix things, it was that he understood systems from the inside out, how they were built and how they could be broken. His work on Arthur's property was not just maintenance, it was reconnaissance. He knew the structural weaknesses, the digital backdoors, and the power sources of the apex better than Arthur did. He carefully put the key and the photograph away. The time was not yet right. He had to be stronger, smarter, and the moment had to be karmically perfect. The cold fate that had taken Ghost was a wound that needed healing, but it was also a catalyst. He wasn't building a new life just for himself. He was preparing for a reckoning that would restore the memory of Elias and avenge the silent victim, the abandoned dog who was dismissed as worthless. He closed his eyes, thinking of the sleek, cold marble floors of the apex and the arrogant laughter that had banished him. He touched the key on his chain again. A cold promise. He was the owner of a forgotten kingdom, and the people who mocked him were unknowingly living in the castle he was preparing to rebuild. The world was about to discover that the simple man had the most complex and powerful secret of all. Months turned into a year. Mark's reputation in Havenwood was solid gold. He was indispensable. His small workshop, a leased space behind the town's bakery, was always busy, but Mark never rushed the work. He was patient with machines and people alike. His quiet life was shattered one late autumn afternoon. Mark was at the town's only decent diner, having a cup of coffee after a long day of wiring a new farm shed. The diner was the social hub of Havenwood, full of local chatter and the comforting smell of grease and strong coffee. Suddenly the door swung open, and the cold mountain air rushed in, followed by the source of Mark's deepest wound, Arthur. Arthur hadn't been to Havenwood proper in over a year. He usually flew guests in by helicopter directly to the apex, but today his enormous black SUV was parked aggressively across 2 spaces outside. He wasn't alone. He was with Julian, his son, and 2 loud, well-dressed business partners. They were clearly celebrating something, their voices booming with the kind of confidence that only comes from knowing you are the loudest person in the room. They took a large booth near the window, and Arthur immediately caught sight of Mark, who was sitting alone at the counter. Mark felt the familiar clenching in his stomach, a physical memory of the snowy night and Ghost's fading breaths. He did not move. He did not flinch. He just kept sipping his coffee, becoming an island of stillness amidst the sudden unwelcome intrusion. Arthur's eyes narrowed, a cruel, satisfied grin stretching across his face. He leaned over to his partners, lowering his voice just enough to ensure everyone in the small diner could strain to hear. "Look who crawled out of the snow," Arthur sneered, loud enough to stop the clatter of silverware. "It's Mark, my former highly incompetent handyman. I told you about him, the one who cried over a stray mongrel and thought he could lecture me on kindness." The silence in the diner was immediate and palpable. All eyes shifted from Arthur's table to Mark. The locals, Clara, the baker, the plough driver, knew Mark, respected him, but they also knew Arthur's reputation and his wealth. The tension was thick, a battle between local trust and intimidating power. Arthur rose and walked toward Mark, deliberately blocking the light, casting a long, arrogant shadow over him. "Still playing with fuses, Mark?" Arthur asked, dripping with sarcasm. "I heard you're the town's savior now. You fix Mrs. Henderson's rusty toaster for $5. That's quite the career trajectory, isn't it? From running a multi-million-dollar heating system to patching up antiques for charity." Julian, the son, piped up from the booth, a high, mocking laugh. He should have stuck to sweeping. At least that's honest work for simple people. Arthur's partners chuckled dutifully, playing their required role in the public humiliation. The laughter echoed again, but this time it didn't reach me. It was like listening to a poorly tuned radio, noise without meaning. I could feel the eyes of the good people of Havenwood on me, and for a moment I felt their collective shame and their growing anger at Arthur's cheap display. But I refused to let his bitterness pollute my composure. Mark simply set his coffee mug down, slowly and deliberately, without spilling a drop. He met Arthur's gaze, not with defiance, but with a profound, unshakable calm. He'd faced down corporate betrayal and the icy grief of losing Ghost. Arthur's petty insults were nothing more than background static. "The toaster works, Arthur," Mark finally said, his voice flat, steady and low. "And Mrs. Henderson is warm. That's what matters." Arthur looked genuinely frustrated by Mark's lack of reaction. He needed a scene. Mark was giving him silence. "No, Mark," Arthur pressed, stepping closer, his voice turning colder. "What matters is success. What matters is power. You chose a dying stray animal over a six-figure salary and security. You failed. You are a failure, Mark. You are a sentimental fool who belongs in this run-down little town, fixing the cast-offs of real society." He paused, waiting for Mark to break. He was waiting for the apology, the subservience, the visible crack of pain. Mark only maintained his eye contact, and in the depth of his gaze there was something Arthur didn't recognize, the certainty of a man who held a secret key to an empire. "Your security, Arthur," Mark stated, almost whispering, yet the words cut through the diner's silence, "is built on things that money can buy. My life is built on things that money cannot buy. You paid me to keep the heat on at the apex, but you couldn't pay me to keep my dignity." He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the counter, his demeanor shifting from passive calm to active conviction. "You chose to let a life die in the snow because you deemed it worthless. That choice will cost you more than you can possibly imagine, because the truth never laughs." Mark pushed his chair back, stood up, and placed a dollar bill next to his mug, more than enough for the coffee. He walked past Arthur without breaking stride, not rushing, not looking back. Arthur was left standing alone, his mouth slightly open, the triumphant air having evaporated. The dutiful chuckles from his partners had died, replaced by an uneasy silence. The people of Havenwood, who had been listening intently, exchanged slow, meaningful nods of approval. Arthur had come to humiliate a pauper, but the pauper had left him feeling exposed and small. The invisible turn had happened. The dignity of the victim had begun to erode the pride of the aggressor. Destiny was moving. Arthur's humiliation in the diner was a minor tremor, but it triggered a disastrous chain reaction. Mark's parting words, the quiet certainty in his voice, had unexpectedly rattled Arthur. Arthur was a man who needed control and absolute deference. Mark's serene defiance was a direct challenge to his perceived omnipotence. Furious and unsettled, Arthur rushed back to the Apex Lodge. He decided that Mark was not just an irritant, but a symbol of the lower class, challenging his authority. He began an immediate and intense review of Mark's past work on the property, seeking any mistake, any flaw, any lapse in maintenance that could be used to legally crush him or simply confirm his own judgment. Arthur didn't find any flaws in the quality of Mark's work. Mark had been meticulously professional. But Arthur's aggressive investigations created another problem. It drew the attention of the very high-level infrastructure security consultant Arthur was currently working with, a man named Mr. Finch. Finch had been hired to implement a new, highly specialized security protocol at the Apex, but he was struggling to integrate it with the complex, proprietary systems Mark had originally installed. Finch, a former corporate investigator, began digging into Mark's background, not to prove incompetence, but to understand the unusual sophistication of the existing infrastructure. Meanwhile, back in Havenwood, Mark experienced his fall, though it was a fall of destiny, not of grace. A massive, late-season blizzard swept through the mountain pass, isolating Havenwood completely. Mark was working late in his small, leased workshop, trying to fix a faulty snowmobile engine, essential for the town's emergency services. The landlord, a man named Henderson, no relation to Mrs. Henderson, was under Arthur's financial influence, owning a much larger, more profitable logging contract with him. The night after the diner confrontation, Henderson appeared at Mark's workshop door, his face clouded with guilt and reluctance. "Mark, I can't explain it," Henderson muttered, refusing to meet Mark's eyes. He held a legal document in his trembling hand. "I need the space back. You have 48 hours to vacate. It's an immediate lease termination clause, a technicality." Mark stood still, his wrench resting on the workbench. He didn't have to ask who was behind it. The timing, the clumsiness, the obvious pressure, it all pointed back to the vindictive wealth of Arthur. Arthur wasn't just firing him now, he was trying to erase him, to eliminate the small, irritating pocket of resistance in the valley below. "Arthur, right?" Mark asked quietly, knowing the answer. Henderson just nodded miserably. He said you needed to be reminded of your place. He said you were a loose end he had to tie up." Mark looked around his small, functional workspace, his sanctuary, the tools, the half-finished projects, the faint smell of oil and honest effort. It was everything he had rebuilt since that first night in the snow. Now it was being taken away again. He was losing his livelihood, his home, as his cabin lease was tied to the workshop, and his fragile foothold in Havenwood. He walked away with nothing, except everything they'd forgotten, his worth. I felt the familiar burn of injustice, but this time it was different. I wasn't scared. I was resolute. Arthur was trying to make me fall, but he was only kicking away the temporary crutches. He was forcing me to finally rely on the truth I carried. The pain was silent and deep. He packed his meager belongings, including the heavy obsidian stone and the key, into a single backpack. As he walked out of the workshop for the last time, the blizzard was raging, a white curtain closing off the world. He didn't seek pity or help from the people of Havenwood. His problem was a moral one, and he needed to solve it on a moral battleground. He found temporary shelter in an old abandoned forest ranger's shack deep in the woods, primitive but safe from the storm. Sitting by a tiny, struggling fire, Mark thought of Ghost. He thought of the cold, dismissive heart of Arthur. He thought of Elias Vance and the promise he had made to restore honor. The loss of the workshop was his lowest point since the night he lost his dog. But paradoxically, it was also his greatest liberation. He had nothing left to lose and therefore nothing left to fear. The constraints of his hidden life were suddenly gone. I realized then that sometimes justice walks slower than pride, but it never stops. Arthur thought he was ending my story. He didn't realize he was simply completing the final preparation stage. He had left me with only one thing left to do: use the full force of the secret I held. The storm outside raged, shaking the small shack, but inside, Mark felt a profound, almost spiritual stillness. He pulled out the engraved key and the photograph of Elias Vance. The time for hiding was over. Arthur's final act of malice had not broken Mark. It had activated Marcus Thorne. The fall had been completed, and now the reckoning was imminent. The arrogance of the aggressor had simply accelerated the destiny of the victim. Mark spent the next 3 weeks in the isolation of the ranger's shack, the blizzard acting as his silent, fiercely protective barrier. This wasn't a time of lament. It was a period of intense focus and reconstruction. Stripped of all physical comforts and social ties, Mark finally turned his attention fully to the secret he carried. He meticulously studied the old blueprints and schematics contained on a secure digital drive he kept with the key. These weren't just designs for power systems, they were the intellectual property of Vance Integrated Systems, the life's work of his mentor, Elias. The betrayal that killed Elias and bankrupted the company was centered on the theft of this data which Mark now possessed. I built again, not to prove them wrong, but to prove myself right. I wasn't driven by the need for revenge against Arthur, but by the overwhelming need for justice. Justice for Elias, justice for Ghost, and justice for the value of honest work that men like Arthur dismissed. Mark's initial plan had been slow and deliberate, perhaps taking years, but Arthur's aggressive cruelty had forced his hand. The key in his hand was the legal and technical foundation to resurrect Vance Systems, but Mark realized he couldn't rebuild a traditional, profit-driven corporation. He had to build something with the conscience Arthur lacked. He decided his new company would be based on two core principles: sustainability and accountability. It would specialize in fixing and maintaining existing, obsolete infrastructure, like Clara's furnace, rather than pushing expensive replacements. The company's mandate would be to prove that intrinsic value, not perpetual consumption, was the foundation of true security. He needed capital and legal cover. Using his highly secure old personal accounts, hidden from the corporate predators for years, Mark initiated contact with the one person he still trusted in the world, Cassandra Cassie Hayes, a brilliant, ethical, but disillusioned former corporate lawyer for Vance Systems. Cassie had left the legal world after Elias's death, disgusted by the corruption. Mark reached her via an encrypted, archaic communication protocol that only the two of them knew. Their first video call, conducted late one night via a satellite uplink Mark rigged using scavenged parts, was emotional. Cassie, who was now working pro bono for environmental causes, looked at the haggard but intensely focused face of Marcus Thorne. "Mark, I thought you were gone forever," she whispered, tears in her eyes. "I was just waiting for the right moment, Cassie," he replied, his voice firm and clear. "They took everything, but they didn't get this." He held up the antique key on the screen. "I have the original IP. I have the foundation. We can resurrect the company, not to chase profits, but to chase the bastards who destroyed Elias." Cassie, energized by the chance for true redemption, immediately agreed to become the legal architect of the new company. They named it Resilience Ventures. The light of the story began to change. The cold, grey atmosphere of the Ranger Shack was now infused with purpose. Mark spent his days working not on repairs, but on strategy. He drafted business plans, financial projections, and most importantly, the charter for the new company. He was using the same genius that built Arthur's secure fortress to build his own ethical empire. The initial funding came from a few forgotten investments Elias had entrusted to Mark, now having matured into a substantial, though not immense, sum. It was enough for Cassie to establish the legal entity and begin the quiet acquisition of certain strategic assets. The light changed. Colors became warmer. My purpose became clearer. I was no longer the fired handyman. I was the founder of a venture designed to prove that conscience is the most powerful resource. Arthur sought to break me down to a beggar, but he only succeeded in forcing me to take up the crown I had previously refused. Mark's focus was sharp. He realized that Arthur's lodge, the apex, was his initial target, not out of petty revenge, but as a symbolic act of justice. Arthur's wealth depended entirely on the reliability of the very systems he had paid Mark to maintain, and which Mark had designed. Mark's ultimate goal was not to seize Arthur's physical property, but to expose the moral bankruptcy of his operation and the systemic vulnerabilities that his arrogance had created. He needed to prove that the simple acts of competence and kindness he showed in Havenwood were worth more than all of Arthur's money. He was preparing to unleash the full force of his hidden value. The reconstruction was complete. The stage for the ultimate karmic confrontation was set. 9 months after Mark left the Ranger's shack, the corporate world received an unexpected shock. A new, highly specialized infrastructure and security firm named Resilience Ventures began making quiet, strategic acquisitions, focusing initially on properties and businesses in the mountain region. The name of the founder was kept strictly confidential, known only through its brilliant legal counsel, Cassandra Hayes, who operated with razor-sharp efficiency and uncompromising ethics. The first major sign of the coming storm hit Arthur directly. His primary business, a complex real estate investment trust focused on luxury mountain properties, was suddenly hit with a barrage of highly detailed, unassailable regulatory complaints. The complaints focused on systemic hidden vulnerabilities in the infrastructure of several key properties, vulnerabilities that compromised both security and environmental standards. The source of the information was forensic, precise, and irrefutable. Arthur was panicked. He needed the vulnerabilities fixed immediately, but his existing security consultant, Mr. Finch, the same man who had investigated Mark, was baffled. Finch couldn't even access the deepest core layers of the proprietary systems Mark had built into Arthur's most prized possession, the Apex Lodge. Arthur's entire infrastructure, power, water, heating, and security had been silently locking him out. In a desperate, frantic attempt to regain control, Arthur's legal team was forced to approach the only firm with the known expertise to understand and repair the unique, proprietary Vance Integrated Systems infrastructure, Resilience Ventures. A meeting was scheduled in a sterile, high-rise conference room in Denver. Arthur, flanked by his lawyers and a bewildered Finch, sat waiting. The tension was palpable. Arthur's arrogance had been replaced by a thin veneer of anxious professionalism. His properties were failing and the market was taking notice. The door opened and Cassie Hayes walked in, followed by a man who moved with a quiet, authoritative grace. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored dark suit, his hair neatly cut, his posture radiating calm confidence. He was no longer the haggard handyman. He was Marcus Thorne. Arthur froze. His jaw went slack. The confident lines around his mouth dissolved into disbelief. "Mark," Arthur managed, the name coming out as a choked, confused whisper. Marcus Thorne sat down slowly, resting his hands, which were now unmarked and calm, on the polished table. He didn't offer a greeting or an explanation. He simply looked at Arthur with the same unshakable calm he had shown in the diner. Cassie, taking charge, placed a stack of documents on the table. "Mr. Thorne is the lead infrastructure analyst for Resilience Ventures, Mr. Arthur. And more pertinently, he is the only person alive who fully understands the proprietary security matrix on which your properties, including the Apex, rely." Mr. Finch, the security consultant, finally spoke up, a look of shocked realization crossing his face. "Vance Systems. Marcus Thorne, the protégé. We thought you were a casualty of the market crash 5 years ago." "I was merely observing the aftermath," Mark replied, his voice deep and measured. Arthur, though terrified, tried to regain his former condescension. "You expect me to believe that the tramp I fired, the man who whined about a stray dog, is now running a firm I need to hire?" Mark finally smiled, a cold, purely intellectual expression. "You saw the clothes, Arthur. You never saw the architect. You saw a handyman. I saw every wire and vulnerability in your empire. Do you recall that night in the snow, Arthur, when you told me that animal was worthless and that I was fired for caring?" Mark leaned forward, the change in his demeanor from handyman to CEO complete. That dog, Arthur, was a victim of your indifference. Your entire system is a victim of your arrogance. Resilience Ventures doesn't just fix infrastructure, we fix imbalances. And your system, the one you think you own, is about to fail completely because it was built on a flawed foundation, the belief that competence and conscience are disposable. He pushed a thick binder across the table. These are the details of the vulnerabilities you need fixed. These are the systems I built. We know exactly how to fix them, and exactly how long it will take to secure your entire estate. Arthur, white-knuckled and defeated, grabbed the binder. He was utterly exposed. The man he had cruelly dismissed as a sentimental fool was now holding the key to his very survival. The same people who mocked him now stood in line for his approval. The poetic justice was silent, surgical, and complete. Mark didn't need to shout or gloat. The simple act of showing up, thriving, and presenting the solution that only he possessed was a humiliation far deeper than any shouted insult. He was not there for revenge. He was there as the unavoidable consequence of Arthur's own actions. The truth had finally come to light, and it was blinding. The silence in the Denver conference room stretched, heavy with the weight of Arthur's past misdeeds. Arthur, pale and sweating beneath his expensive suit, was finally staring at the moral catastrophe his arrogance had created. He realized that the man he had contemptuously dismissed had not been weak. He had simply been patient, allowing Arthur's own hubris to dig the final hole. Arthur knew he was beaten. Mark, or rather Marcus Thorne, held every card: the technical knowledge, the legal standing, and the moral high ground. The cost of not hiring Resilience Ventures would be catastrophic, leading to regulatory fines, market collapse, and the complete failure of the apex. "What do you want, Mark?" Arthur asked, his voice rough, stripped of its false authority. "A percentage? The apex itself? Name your price. I'll pay anything." Marcus Thorne looked at him, and the expression in his eyes was neither anger nor triumph, but a deep, sorrowful disappointment. "You still don't understand, Arthur," Mark said softly. "You think everything is about price. It's not about the apex. It's not about your money. Resilience Ventures is already valued higher than your entire trust. I don't need your possessions." He paused, letting the statement sink in, the ultimate humiliation. His former aggressor's entire empire was now smaller than the company he quietly built from the ashes of betrayal and pain. "I came here for one reason, to prove that value isn't assigned by wealth, but by conscience," Mark continued. "You thought my concern for a cold, dying dog made me a failure. You were wrong. That dog, Ghost, was the first victim of your cruelty that I couldn't save. He was the catalyst that reminded me of my purpose." Mark pushed a single sheet of paper across the table, the proposed contract for the urgent repair and security services. The terms were highly favorable to Arthur, costing him only the standard market rate. Arthur looked at the price, bewildered. "There is one non-negotiable term," Mark said, his voice firming slightly. "You will sign a full public legal declaration drafted by Ms. Hayes, acknowledging the systemic ethical failures that led to the vulnerabilities in your properties. This declaration must also include a mandatory substantial annual donation to a newly established animal rescue foundation operating in the mountain region, a foundation dedicated to strays like Ghost." Arthur was aghast. "A public declaration? That's ruinous to my reputation. It's professional suicide." "It is not suicide, Arthur," Mark corrected him calmly. "It is accountability. It is the beginning of redemption. You don't need revenge. The truth had already done it. Your reputation is already ruined by your actions. This is your only path back to functionality, not just for your systems, but for your soul." Mark stood up, signaling the meeting was over. He had not sought an apology, nor had he required Arthur's personal degradation. He had enforced a moral consequence that was larger than both of them. I didn't need revenge. Revenge is a fleeting satisfaction that binds you to the past. I needed resolution. Arthur's pain wasn't my victory. His forced acknowledgement of his ethical failure, the acceptance of accountability, that was the true triumph. I was demonstrating true greatness, using power not to crush, but to enforce a better moral system. Arthur, defeated and stripped of his pride, knew he had no choice. He looked at the sheet of paper, then at the confident, serene face of Marcus Thorne, the man he had left to die in the snow with a dog. He finally saw the vast chasm between his material wealth and Mark's moral superiority. He saw his own smallness reflected in the calmness of his former employee. The following week, the declaration was released. It was a corporate tremor, shocking the industry, but forcing a conversation about ethical standards and corporate responsibility. Mark had won, not by taking Arthur's money, but by forcing him to acknowledge that the life of a discarded dog, the life he deemed worthless, had more power than all his billions. Mark walked away from the confrontation with a serene spiritual victory. He had enforced justice without losing his own humanity. He was whole. Months passed after the resolution with Arthur. The media storm surrounding the Resilience Ventures acquisition and Arthur's unprecedented public declaration eventually faded. But the impact of Marcus Thorne's action, the victory of conscience over capital, left a lasting ripple effect. Arthur's properties were secured, not by his money, but by the moral force of the man he had wronged. He had been forced to invest in the very things he once scorned, integrity and compassion. Mark, now Marcus Thorne, did not return to the high-rise corporate world. He maintained a strategic oversight of Resilience Ventures, ensuring its mission to restore value and accountability to discarded systems remained central. The day-to-day operations were skillfully managed by Cassie Hayes. Mark returned to Havenwood. He purchased the small plot of land where his old leased workshop stood, rebuilt it, and dedicated the space to the new Animal Rescue Foundation, the one Arthur was now contractually obligated to fund. It was a beautiful irony. The place Arthur tried to erase Mark's livelihood was now a sanctuary, founded on the memory of the dog Arthur deemed worthless. Mark kept his small, rustic cabin. He continued to work with his hands, fixing the community's systems and mentoring young people in Havenwood who showed a knack for engineering and a deep sense of ethical responsibility. He was Mark, the fixer, the neighbor, the quiet source of wisdom. The corporate titan was merely a title he wore lightly, a necessary tool for the greater purpose. One peaceful afternoon, Mark stood outside the new foundation building. The sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows across the snow-dusted ground. A small, three-legged black dog, recently rescued, hobbled over and nudged Mark's hand, seeking the familiar, quiet comfort he offered. Mark knelt, his strong hand stroking the animal's head. In the end, I didn't need their applause. I didn't need Arthur's humiliation to be public. I needed to know that the lesson had been learned, not just by him, but by me. Real triumph is knowing you stayed kind in a cruel world. The story of Ghost wasn't a tragedy. It was the hinge of his destiny. The injustice of that cold night had stripped away his disguise and forced Marcus Thorne to embrace his true ethical power. He had proved that even the humblest life, a stray dog, a fired handyman, carries an intrinsic worth that can outlast the greatest fortunes. Mark looked up at the vast, silent mountain range, the peaks now glowing a soft pink in the twilight. The Apex Lodge was hidden from view, but its presence no longer held any power over him. His victory was not in the defeat of his aggressor, but in the internal peace that came from aligning his immense capability with his unwavering conscience. I learned that the true measure of a person is not how much they own, but how much they care for what is owned by others, be it reputation, life, or simply a tired old system. Arthur's lesson was hard-earned. Mine was forged in the cold silence of the snow. Mark's voice fades into a final, intimate reflection. The victory true is not about conquering others. It is about conquering the bitterness and the anger inside yourself. I could have chosen revenge, but I chose resurrection. Resurrection of my purpose, resurrection of Elias's legacy, and resurrection of the simple truth that every soul has worth, even when the world forgets. The cold truth is that the world will always forget names and numbers, but it will always remember the feeling of being treated with dignity and the profound power of a kindness shown when it was least deserved. He stood up, the rescued dog trotting happily by his side. The camera slowly begins to pull back, moving away from the quiet scene of peace and purpose, rising above the valley, leaving the audience with the lasting image of a man who found his greatest strength in his deepest pain. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to remember that value is not in what you have, but in who you are.